So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Effective Crisis Communication Management, Navigating Gender-Based Violence in Higher Education, which is part of the Sister Project webinar series coordinated by Aggregep. Today's webinar is offered by GenderSafe, and my name is Panayota Policarpou, coming from the Yellow Window team. So to start with some housekeeping rules, please keep your microphones muted during the webinar, but feel free to leave your cameras on if possible. This webinar, as you will see, is recorded and will be then uploaded on YouTube, but your names and videos will not be shown. And also the Q&A session that we will have at the end will not be included in the webinar, so have that in mind as well. For this Q&A session, we will address your questions in the last part of the webinar, so feel free to type your questions throughout the presentations and discussions in the chat box, and then we will address them directly. If not possible, we will collect them and send the answers to you after the session. Kindly keep your questions as concise and prompt as possible to ensure that everyone has a chance to participate. So to start with today's objectives, this webinar, as I mentioned before, is offered by GenderSafe, and it aims to help you first understand the basic principles and immediate steps of crisis communication in the context of gender-based violence cases. It will also help you to gain some insights into handling internal and external communication during a crisis, ensuring empathy, transparency, and factual reporting. And of course, to learn some key elements of messages addressing to internal and external audiences. Now, we'll start today's presentation with an opening message as an introduction to this webinar series by Juliana Kobolak from MADE, the Hungarian University of Agriculture and Life Sciences, also the coordinator of Aggregep. We will then present the UniSAFE Crisis Communication Checklist, and then we will hear from two guest speakers on their tips and advice. We have today with us Annabelle Namil, the Gender Equality and Diversity Officer at the Central European University, and Maxime Forrest, the Senior Research Fellow and Lecturer at Science PO. We'll finalize this webinar with the Q&A session with your questions. But for now, I'd like to pass the floor to Juliana.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Aggregep project, I would like to say thank you, first of all, for the invited speakers for accepting the invitation and participating in today's webinar. So today's session is the first in a series of 6 webinars, which will be organized by 6 sister projects, most of which focus on the implementation of gender equality plans. The series is organized by the Aggregep project with the strong support of our mentors. But each session is hosted by one project of this sister project group. And the topics are chosen on a way that it would relate to the focus area of the main focus area of the sister project. However, but may be of broader interest to you. The next session will be the current session is hosted by GenderSafe, as you can hear, but the forthcoming event is organized by Aggregep, a project concentrating on stakeholder mapping and engagement issues on gender equality field. But the upcoming one is related to gender-sensitive communication, and the next one is about gender and intersectionality in artificial intelligence research and innovation. And one of the series is about the institutional level barriers integrating education in STEM fields. So the current collaboration of the sister project aims to present good practices, raise awareness, promote communication, and of course have to expand and better embed the network of partners within these project, especially coming from the widening countries as newcomers in the gender equality field. So we hope that the webinars will provide useful information for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the opening message, Juliana. We appreciate this overview, and we'll provide also more information about the registration of the second webinar that is coming up in the end of next month at the end of this webinar. So to start with, as I mentioned before, the next part of our webinar focuses on the key elements of the checklist in crisis communication developed by UniSAFE. So this checklist is designed to guide research and higher education institutions through this challenging process of crisis communication in the event of a case of gender-based violence at the institution is getting wide and public attention. So as you can imagine, such situation requires a swift, sensitive and well-grounded and strategic response to address public concerns, while also safeguarding, of course, the welfare of the university community. So this document provides a structured approach to navigating these complex matters. It ensures effective communication, victim protection, and the preservation of the institutional integrity. The checklist is mostly addressed to administrators or communication professionals or any other staff involved in addressing gender-based violence. It might be the gender equality officers, task forces, working groups, committees, etc. And it serves as a resource for those who are responsible for developing and executing crisis communication strategies. So as you will see from the checklist, and this is going to be the structure of our presentation today, the checklist has two main steps regarding the communication steps. The steps that needs to be taken before the crisis and communication actions that needs to be followed during and after the crisis. In addition, there are two important audiences that we need to keep in mind: internal and external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders are considered the members of the academic community. It might be the administrative and academic staff, our students, while externals, we consider the media, the alumni, the donors, and the broader publics. Now, to be more precise, when we refer to a crisis in the context of this checklist, we're talking about situations where a case of gender-based violence within an institution draws significant public attention, potentially, of course, affecting the institution's reputation, the well-being of the community, and it requires a coordinated and immediate response. So this checklist is not intended for every case that becomes known to the institution, but specifically for those that escalate to the level of public attention. So to start with, first and foremost, before any crisis occurs, the crisis management team has to be formed. This team has to be diverse, to include members with expertise in gender-based violence. And this is very important because these cases have unique dynamics and sensitivities that requires specialized knowledge and skills. At least one member of the team, we advise to be trained in crisis communication. If this isn't possible, then it is advised to arrange media response training for the team members, because crisis communication is a skill that involves actually knowing how to deliver a message that is clear, is empathetic, and effective under pressure. So proper training ensures that your communications will be managed professionally and thoughtfully. Then it's important that the communication objectives are outlined. These steps is very essential because it sets the framework for all the subsequent actions and ensures that actually everyone involved is aligned with the same priorities. I'll give some examples of what goals should focus on. First and foremost, we advise for victim protection. This primary objective must always be to protect the victims. This means that we need to ensure the safety and privacy, but also the emotional well-being of the victims. It's important to remember that in the aftermath of gender-based violent cases, victims are often vulnerable and may feel re-traumatized by the attention their case receives. So when we ensure their protection, it's not only about their physical safety, but also about safeguarding their mental and emotional health. Another objective could be accountability. the institution must take responsibility for addressing the crisis, and accountability actually helps to build trust within the community and demonstrates the institution's commitment to addressing and rectifying these issues transparently and responsibly. Another goal could be the acknowledgement of the crisis. It's essential to recognize the severity of the situation publicly. It is suggested to, of course, avoid downplaying the incident. Instead, we openly acknowledge the crisis, and this openness is crucial for maintaining the credibility and trust. It shows that the institution is not trying to hide the problem, and it's serious about addressing it. Of course, before any crisis, it is important that the communication principles are also outlined. Such as principles might be empathy, transparency, honesty, and cultural sensitivity. Communication should always show empathy towards the victims and the affected community. Empathy in communication actually helps to humanize the institution's response. It makes it clear that there's genuine concern and understanding for those affected by the crisis. And transparency and honesty, which we'll repeat a lot today, builds also the trust and shows that the institution is handling the crisis responsibly. Transparency actually involves to be open about what is known, what is being done, and we also look into this in more detail later. Culture sensitivity also acknowledges the diverse backgrounds and experiences of the university community, and it ensures that whatever is communicated is respectful and appropriate for all audiences. Now, during this stage, it is also suggested to develop a crisis response protocol that outlines whatever we mentioned just now. Who is part of this crisis management team? What are the key goals and objectives? What is our key principles? This ensures that we are coordinated, we're aligned, we have a comprehensive approach to manage the crisis. Such protocol should detail the steps to be taken immediately after a crisis identified, and a well-defined protocol actually ensures that everyone knows their role and responsibilities, which is a very critical for a coordinated and effective response in such cases. So as we will also discuss in more detail later, clear strategies for both internal and external communications are highly important. Internal communication keeps the university community informed and united, while the external communication manage public perception and media relations. So in addition, such protocol should also outline the support services available for victims, bystanders, and the wider academic community. This includes counseling, legal assistance, and any other resource that might help victims cope with the aftermath of the case. We'll look into this later again. Now, guidelines for reviewing and improving policies and the general practices we have in place are also recommended, as this will ensure that the institution learns from the crisis and strengthens its policies to prevent future occurrences. Again, we'll touch upon these in the internal part. And as soon as now a crisis is known and is identified, you now immediately notify the crisis management team and activate your crisis response protocol. So this immediate action is very crucial to ensure that the swift and organized response that we wish to have. And it's important to note that the first meeting of a crisis management team will usually aim to coordinate your response. It should focus on gathering the initial information to assess the situation and determine your next steps. Therefore, you aim to gather all the relevant details and accurate information that are essential for making informed decisions and communicate effectively. And at this stage, it is also important to evaluate the immediate needs and safety of the victims and ensure that these are prioritized. As we mentioned before, if one of our goals is the victim protection, this should be the first item to be discussed. This might involve arranging medical care, providing emotional support, and ensuring their physical safety. So it's important as a first step to evaluate the immediate needs and safety for the victims and bystanders if they are involved. And as mentioned earlier, the two primary audiences for your communication strategies are the internal and external stakeholders. So in this section now, we will explore how to effectively communicate with internal stakeholders, our faculty, our staff, students, etc. This internal communication is a critical component of the crisis management because it helps to maintain, to build this trust, to reduce misinformation, and ensures that actually everyone within the institution is aligned in their response. So when developing messages for internal stakeholders, clarity and empathy are paramount. In times of such crisis, emotions can run high. And of course, the way we communicate can either calm the situation or exacerbate it. So your messages must be unambiguous and straightforward. Avoid using technical jargon or vague statements, because everyone from student to faculty members, they should be able to understand the information provided without any confusion. Of course, empathy involves acknowledging the emotional impact that the incident has had on the community. So your language should reflect an understanding of the distress and concern that many may be feeling. The next step is to share information about the incident and the steps being taken to address it. This is where transparency becomes very crucial. It's important to only share, of course, information that is appropriate and legally permissible. While, of course, you want to be transparent, you must also respect the privacy of those involved, particularly the victim or victims. And transparency here is your best tool to prevent rumors from spreading. If the institution is perceived as withholding some information, it can lead to speculation and mistrust. For example, if an internal investigation is underway, you should communicate that clearly. You can say an internal, for example, communication is being conducted. We will provide updates as soon as they become available. We ask for your patience and understanding as we go through this process. So it's not enough to inform the community about what has happened, but you also need to communicate what the institution is doing in response. So this demonstrates that the institution is taking the incident seriously and is committed to making necessary changes. Remember to reassure the community that the institution is committed to resolving the situation and preventing future incidents. And of course, whatever you communicate has to also be reflected internally. We cannot communicate things that are not actually taking place. This is very important. Now, next, it's essential to promote a sense of collective responsibility within the institution. This crisis is not just an issue for the administration or the crisis management team. It's something that affects and involves the entire community. So the collective responsibility means that you stress that managing the situation effectively is a shared responsibility. This might involve encouraging faculty and staff to provide support to students. We will also consider later to provide a guide on how faculty can support throughout this crisis, or urging all members of the community to engage in discussion on how to improve campus safety, for example. So a good practice here is to set up dedicated channels for the community to express and discuss their concerns. These platforms can serve as a space for managing and aligning community expectations, fostering an environment of support and mutual understanding during this crisis. So when communicating during a crisis, especially in cases involving sensitive issues like gender-based violence, the way we craft and deliver our message is very crucial. Some additional tips for this message is that before any message is disseminated, of course, it's paramount, it's imperative that it is reviewed by the crisis communication team. This team is composed, as we said, of individuals who bring various perspectives and expertise, ensuring that the message is comprehensive and appropriate for the situation. Consistency in messaging is key, of course, to maintain the credibility and trust that we repeated before. When messages vary across different channels or communications, it can create confusion. can spread misinformation and damage the institution's reputation. And whether the message is delivered through email or internal channels, the core content should be consistent. This means that the facts, the tone, and the key points should be the same, no matter how or where the message is communicated. For example, if you state in an internal email that an investigation is ongoing, this should also be clearly stated in the external communications that we're going to touch upon later. Trust is a cornerstone of effective crisis communication, and in time of crisis, stakeholders need to feel confident that their concerns are being heard, and that the institution is taking appropriate action. So make it clear that all concerns raised by stakeholders will be acknowledged. Of course, this has to be followed by action. This can be as simple as setting the dedicated channels that we mentioned before for feedback, and ensuring that every concern is responded to in a timely manner. So it's not enough to just acknowledge concerns. You must also demonstrate that these concerns are being actively addressed. This might involve providing updates on actions taken in response to feedback, or explaining how the institution is adjusting its approach based on stakeholder input. For example, you can say in response to the concerns raised by our community, we have extended our support to services to ensure that everyone affected has access to the help they need. So by consistently acknowledging and addressing concerns, you build and maintain trust within the communities. And this trust is essential not only for managing the current crisis, but also for the institution's long-term reputation and credibility. Now, moving on, support services is a crucial component to the institution's responses to any crisis, particularly one involving gender-based violence. Providing timely and accessible support to those affected demonstrates the institution's commitment to the well-being of the community, and actually helps to mitigate the emotional and psychological impact of the incident. So the first step is to clearly communicate the availability of support services, such as counseling, legal consultation, and any other relevant resource. And it's important that these services are easily, first of all, accessible, and that all stakeholders know how to access them. But providing this information is not just about listing services. It also shows that the institution is taking concrete steps to those affected. And of course, you need to ensure beforehand that such services have the capacity, but most important, the knowledge to address requests for support. And as I mentioned before, faculty and teaching staff often play a very important role in supporting students during such crises. So it's important also to consider how you can equip them, perhaps with some guidelines, that they need to handle sensitive conversations effectively and compassionately. So these guidelines should be clear, practical, and of course is easy to implement. Now, moving on, when a case of gender-based violence occurs, initiating an investigation is a very critical step in the response process. These, of course, ensures that the matter is handled with the seriousness it deserves, and that all the necessary actions that are outlined perhaps in your protocol are taken to uncover the truth and hold those responsible accountable. So deciding whether to conduct an internal investigation is often the first step. So this decision should be made based on the specifics of the case and based on the protocol of each university. And an internal investigation also allows the institution to quickly gather facts and take the immediate action. So in some cases, it may be necessary to collaborate with external authorities, such as law enforcement or external legal advisors. This is something that you can communicate in a way that we work closely with the external authorities to ensure that the investigation is conducted with highest standards of integrity and impartiality. These are some key messages that can be communicated throughout this process. So providing these ongoing updates is essential for maintaining transparency and accountability throughout the crisis management process, because regular updates and communication helps the community to be informed and engaged, and it reinforces the institution's commitment for handling the crisis. This includes also sharing progress reports on the investigation, updates on the support services, and any other new actions being taken. Such updates, of course, helps you to prevent speculation and ensures that everyone is aware of what is happening. As I mentioned before, while we want to be transparent, it's important and to respect the privacy of those involved, particularly the victims. So this means we have to be mindful of what information is shared, what information is shared, ensuring that communications do not inadvertently cause harm. And finally, addressing feedback and concerns from the community is a critical aspect of such response. It shows that we're actively listening and responding to the needs of voice of stakeholders. Now, the next part focuses on effective external communication, which is also vital during such crisis. The way we communicate with external audiences, and as a reminder, I repeat that external audience, we consider the media, the alumni, our donors, and the broader public. The way we communicate with them can significantly impact the institution's reputation and the trust it holds with these stakeholders. So before releasing any information externally, it's crucial that all messages are reviewed and approved by the crisis communication team, as similarly discussed for the internal communication. The public statement is one of the most important aspects of external communication. It should be carefully crafted to address the incident directly, while also emphasizing the institution's commitment to resolving the situation. The tone should be professional, empathetic, and transparent. It's essential to let the external audiences know where they can find updates on the situation. This could be through the institution's website, social media channels, press releases, etc. So consistent, accessible updates help to manage public perception, and it provides a central source of truth, reducing the spread of the misinformation. Now, some key elements to consider in external communication is to first acknowledge that the incident has occurred. And this transparency actually is critical for building the trust that we mentioned before, also with the external community, and shows that the institution is not trying to downplay or hide the issue. It's important also to convey that the institution is dedicated to ensuring the safety and justice for all individuals involved. And it's also important to clearly state that the institution is following the established procedures. This reassures the stakeholders that the situation is being handled professionally and in accordance with legal and ethical standards. Of course, emphasize that protecting the victims and anyone affected by the incident, is a top priority. This shows the empathy and the commitment of the well-being of those involved. And if the crisis reveals some gaps or weaknesses in existing policies, it's important to acknowledge these and outline how the institution plans to address them. This demonstrates a commitment to improvement and accountability. So make sure that, of course, any commitment made by the institution are realistic and achievable. Overpromising can lead to further issues if the institution cannot follow through. So as previously mentioned, while being transparent, it's essential to respect the privacy of the victims and those involved. So avoid sharing unnecessary details that could lead to further harm. So moving on to some additional items to consider for the external communication, it's the management of the media relations. It is suggested to have a designated spokesperson who is trained in crisis communication and understands the complexity of the situation. This person should be able to communicate effectively with the media, ensuring that the institution's message is conveyed clearly and accurately. Whenever possible, use written statements and press releases to manage communication, because this approach minimizes also the risk of miscommunication or off-the-cuff remarks that could be misinterpreted. It's essential also to keep a close watch on how the media and public are reacting to the situation. This allows the institution to respond quickly to any inaccuracies or negative narratives. And next is the engagement with the external entities. Determine clearly which external entities need to be informed about the incident. This might include legal authorities, sponsors, donors, and any other key stakeholders. It's important to categorize these groups based on the urgency and relevance of the information. So ensure that the public statement aligns with the internal communication to maintain the consistency that we mentioned before, and to avoid any discrepancies that could cause confusion. So release the public statements across various media channels, including the institution's website, social media platforms, and through press releases. This broad dissemination ensures that the message reaches actually all the relevant audiences. Remember to monitor media and social media platform for responses. This will help you measure the public sentiment. However, you should not be engaged in any speculative discussions. And engagement in social media should be only to reiterate official statements and avoid getting drawn into discussions or debate that could detract from the institution's message. And you can communicate that by saying that we will use our social media platforms to reinforce our official statements and to provide updates, but we will avoid engaging in speculative discussions. So maintaining a continuous external communication similar to what we discussed before for the internal is crucial for ensuring the transparency that we wish to achieve. So once an investigation has been initiated, it's important to publicly announce these steps. These announcements should include also details about the composition of the investigation committee and any external members involved. By sharing this information, the institution demonstrates its commitment to a thorough and impartial investigation process. Now, once the investigation is concluded, it's critical to communicate the findings of and the steps the institution will take in response. This final communication actually should be comprehensive and include several key elements as you see now. Without necessarily specifying the details, communicate that the investigation identified breaches of policy. If the investigation results in the composition of sanctions, it's important to communicate this clearly, though with, of course, appropriate discretion. So using this opportunity to highlight areas where the institution policies or procedures need improvement, it's good to be done as the conclusive, let's say, message. This does not only show a commitment to learning from the incident, but also positions the institution as proactive in preventing future occurrences. We can say that the investigation has highlighted several areas where our policies can be strengthened. We're taking immediate actions to address these gaps and to enhance our protocols to better protect our community. So finally, reaffirm the institution's ongoing commitment to safety and transparency. This helps to restore confidence in the institution and reassures stakeholders that the institution is dedicated to creating a safer environment. Having said that, we now conclude the presentation of the UniSAFE Crisis Communication Checklist, which you can find the UniSAFE toolkit, and we'll provide it later on via email as well. We remind you at this stage to keep track of your questions in the chat box. We will address them after our next part. And our next part, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll host 2 guest speakers to hear from them on tips and advice on the topic. So I'd like to introduce now first Annabelle and Emil, the Gender Equality and Diversity Officer at the Central European University, and Maxime Forrest, Senior Research Fellow and Lecturer at Science PO. Anna and Maxime, welcome, and thank you for being with us today. I'd like to start with Anna first. Briefly, I will share with you her bio, and then we'll dive into our discussion. So Anna, as I mentioned, is the Gender Equality and Diversity Officer at the Central European University. She's a strong advocate for LGBTQ+ rights, sexual orientation and gender identity, and sexual and reproductive health rights. She has a background as a clinical psychologist, but also background in women's and gender studies. She joined Central European University as Gender Equality Officer for the European Project Supera, Her main role back then was to coordinate the design, the implementation, and the monitoring of the CEU's first gender equality plan. And she has also worked as a gender equality trainer for another EU-funded project, what we know as GE Academy, Gender Equality Academy. So Anna, thank you so much for being here with us. Thanks a lot for coming to share your experience and tips. So this part of our presentation, we have a different format, and more like an interview format. So I'd like to start with the first question for you, Anna. As we all know, media relations can be challenging during such crisis. What are your tips for managing media inquiries and ensuring that the institution's message is conveyed accurately and effectively?
Thank you very much, Pan. Can everybody, I guess you can hear me and see me?
Yes.
Thanks for the nodding. Thanks very much for the introduction and for the invitation, of course, always a pleasure. Honestly, your presentation was extremely comprehensive. So while I was following what you were presenting, I was wondering what else I could bring to the discussion. So I will, of course, try my best. Whereas also letting people know I'm not a communications expert. So I can only speak from my experience as gender equality officer, from my background, this mixed background in psychology and gender studies. And from, yes, basically from the experience that I've collected also during the discussions in different projects on this matter, including UniSAFE. So indeed, many of the things that you mentioned, Pan, before regarding these tips in order to convey a clear message on the side of the institution, I can only emphasize or reiterate from a bit from a different angle. I think the first thing that I would like to highlight and underline is being proactive. So addressing, not directly engaging with rumors, as you well mentioned, or speculations, but being proactive in delivering official statements, correcting misinformation promptly. So here the timing and fast reactions are absolutely key. That's why I think it's really good that so many of you are attending this webinar, because most of this work should actually be happening before a crisis occurs, and not so it doesn't catch you off guard when things are taken up by the media and you have to pull everything together last minute in order to react. That always leads to, you know, an increased chance of making mistakes at the moment of sending a message. So being fast, correcting misinformation promptly with a preset communication plan is of utmost importance. And also regularity of the communication. So ongoing updates really help mitigate rumors and really help preventing these rumors from expanding. I would say it's not good practice to send one official communication or give one official communication at the beginning of the crisis and then no follow-up to that, because you're giving space for speculation to build up. So when there's silence on the side of the institution, that's where you are giving more room for speculation and rumors. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, of course, selecting a trained spokesperson who can clearly and confidently communicate the institution's message. Ideally, this person should have a background in media relations or crisis communication. These are, as you mentioned, very specialized skills that not all of us have, especially under pressure. So to prepare and to control the message as much as possible. I think it's also very important for all of us to keep in mind that the institution can control what it says, but it cannot control the reactions to it, nor it should engage in speculation. So you can control what comes from you, but you cannot control what other people will say about that. So craft clear, concise, and consistent key messages that address the main points of the crisis. This should include, as you also mentioned, the institution's actions and commitments, the steps that are being taken to prevent recurrence, and the steps that are being taken to support victim survivors. Communicate with empathy and respect, acknowledging the seriousness of the situation, the impact on those involved, but be very mindful of the privacy of individuals affected by the crisis. And I would like to speak a little bit more about this later on, but I will stop here for these questions so we have time to engage in a discussion later on this.
Yes, thanks a lot, Anna. Very insightful. Thanks for highlighting the importance of proactiveness that we also highlighted at the beginning. And you mentioned now the importance of providing support now at the end. What are, from your perspective and experience, some good or best practices for supporting victims and witnesses of gender-based violence during and after a crisis? How should these be? How should these practices be communicated to the university community?
Basically, I think it's important to remember first and foremost that the support that the institution gives victim survivors of gender-based violence should be part of an institutional policy, a wider institutional policy on gender-based violence that adequately addresses protection and provision of services as fundamental pillars. These are two of the 7 Ps of the 7P model elaborated in UniSAFE that I absolutely invite if participants here in the webinar, you are not familiarized with the 7P model, I absolutely recommend you having a look at this model, because it really clearly states what the main components of comprehensive gender-based violence policy should be addressing. So support is not something that comes out of the blue, but should be part of a systematic internal policy. Of course, it can always happen that a crisis surprises an institution before any policy is set in place. But ideally, this is the situation. So some examples, some good examples of support that can be provided by the institution to victim survivors include: first, ensuring the availability of psychological counseling, medical, social, legal services, as well as academic support and financial aid if needed. Of course, within the possibilities of the institution, offer relocation services, including housing adjustments, providing reasonable adjustments for students with disabilities or other health issues, particularly mental health issues during the process. And generally, I would say adopt an intersectional approach to victim survivor protection. So not only from a lenses of health, mental health, and disabilities, but a survivor-centered approach to protection and support should be always intersectional. So taking into account that the needs of the people involved in a case of gender-based violence will change depending on how the particular person is situated in diverse accesses of inequalities and discrimination. So do bear in mind, for example, cases of students, but it might as well be employees who might be third country nationals, in which suspension or of their studies or suspension of their work contract might mean or might escalate to a situation in which they are risking residency permits or visa statuses. So it's really important that whatever we do from the point of view of the protection is not a standardized only a standardized model, but it really takes into account the particularities of the case and the particular vulnerabilities of the people who are involved in the case. Important also to be mindful and at this point also humble that not all the expertise and capacity may be available within the institution. So it's important to create partnerships with external organizations to ensure comprehensive range of support services when the institution cannot provide those services by itself. This could be, for example, legal counseling provided by the city council, for example. I'm based in Vienna, and it is the case that at the city level, there are several organizations that are paid by the government to provide legal assistance to victims of gender-based violence, to women, to etc. They are generally and hopefully some governmental support in this case, also local NGOs and helplines that are available locally. So it is really important to do a mapping of this beforehand and to collect this information, to make it available to complement any support given by the institution. How to communicate these resources, both provided by the institution and by third parties, this should be done continuously, systematically. It should target the entire institutional community, and here you have several channels. Basically, the official channels of the university, including the university website, orientation programs at the beginning of the academic year, student handbooks, employee handbooks, newsletter, specially targeted communication at the moment of a crisis. And often these strategies, these communication strategies, are part of the awareness raising and policy dissemination tasks that are listed in institutional policy. So here I come back once again to the fact that these two parts of the question that you put forward, Pan, both on how to best support victims and how to communicate this, should be something that we thought about way in advance, and we have listed and we have clarified and we have committed to as an institution in an institutional policy. So this is the ideal scenario. Of course, any support that the university or the institution is offering is part of its general duty of care, which focus on the needs and safety of the individuals involved and the entire community, regardless of the investigation outcome. So I want to really highlight here that the institution must provide support before facts have been clarified through an investigation or before there's any conclusion of an investigative procedure. We cannot wait until we find out whether there was or was not a breach of policy in order to provide protection to all people who need it and who are requesting it.
Thank you so much for the practical examples, Anna. You also highlighted another P, the P of partnerships, that has to do with the external community of the university and how we need to utilize it in such cases. And moving to the last question for you, crisis communication also often involves the legal considerations that we discussed. I briefly mentioned this. How can institutions actually navigate while these still maintain? How can we navigate with this while still maintaining an open and honest dialogue with the stakeholders?
Thank you for this question, and this is the point that I find most difficult to deal with. I'm not a lawyer, so here I'm here to say all the things that I'm not. I'm not a communications expert. I'm not a lawyer. So I want to thank my colleague, Diana Puerto Michaud from Central European University, who is working with me and gave me some very, very useful advice on, she's a lawyer herself, and gave me some very useful advice on this particular topic. So I want to give her proper credit for this. We thought of this question together. And this is where I would try to be a little bit more provocative in my answer and say that as an institution, I would dare to say that as an institution, in cases of crisis, as the ones that we're discussing, when a case of gender-based violence reaches media attention and we are asked to give explanation, I think we're bound to disappoint. I think we're bound to disappoint in one way or the other our stakeholders, because the legal considerations in crisis communications are really, really important. So first thing we need to do is to seek legal advice early in the crisis, consult with legal experts who specialize in gender-based violence from a hopefully survivor-centered approach, to understand the legal obligations of the institution. So including reporting requirements to authorities, privacy law, and potential liabilities. So it is really key here to understand the legal obligations that bind the institution's actions, because these obligations are primarily there in place to protect the rights of stakeholders, including but not limited to the victim survivor. So the institution should inform the public, so both internal but also external stakeholders, about the origin of these obligations. So whether it's EU legislation such as GDPR, national law, internal policy, and what the implications are of these obligations. So for example, that you are not able to disclose certain information, or that confidentiality measures prevent the institution from disclosing certain details. These obligations derive primarily, not only, but mainly from GDPR, so from data protection, and from the duty of confidentiality. So this really sets a limit to what you can say when it comes to sharing information about the case, so basically about what's going on, taking into account that if a formal investigation has been initiated, the duty of confidentiality protects every aspect of the procedure, and therefore those in charge of communicating will not be allowed to share names, will not be allowed to share facts or details of what happened. In fact, if this is the case, the crisis communication team should not even have access rights to the case. So unless they are allowed to do so by the institution's internal policy, which is generally not the case. So you will have a crisis communication team that most likely won't have access to the details or shouldn't have access to the details of the case. So you really need to choose your words carefully, avoiding statements that could be interpreted as admissions of guilt or accusations. Use neutral language that conveys empathy and concern, but also avoiding prejudgment. And always when it's a case that is under investigation, you have to speak of alleged victim survivor or alleged perpetrator or alleged event, because there's no certainty, there's no confirmation yet. You can also talk about reporting or respondent parties. You can reassure and reaffirm the institution's commitment and the legal obligation to comply with every measure mandated by the authorities. You can, of course, talk about the procedure. You can talk about the way that the procedure is developing, and what's the institution role in it, and what are the responsible bodies at stake during the procedure. But you won't be able to share much more. And this is why I say that I think we're bound to disappoint, because most people will feel that there's not enough content that is being shared, not enough substantial or substantive content that is being shared about the case. This is simply because we cannot do that due to confidentiality, and this is very much connected to your question on protection. And there's something that I want to draw everybody's attention to, that is particularly important in cases of gender-based violence, and it's a phenomenon that occurs in gender-based violence cases, or tends to occur in gender-based violence cases, and not necessarily in other types of crises that might occur. And it's a phenomenon with the acronym DARVO. I don't know if all of you are familiar with it. It's DARVO. And this is a particular phenomenon, as I say, generally generally occurs in gender-based violence cases, in which there's the strategy of the alleged perpetrator, in this case, is to deny the behavior they are being accused of, attack the individual, which is the individual who is putting forward the report, reverse the role of victims and offenders. So what tends to happen is that alleged perpetrators, as soon as they find themselves being the respondent party of an accusation of gender-based violence, and sometimes even before this accusation or this is being formally reported, they reverse the roles of victim and perpetrator, and they themselves put forward a report against the victim, as if the victim survivor were actually the perpetrators themselves. And this means that the roles of victim, survivor, and perpetrator get completely erased and eroded and reversed. And there's a serious risk that if we do not absolutely respect confidentiality and privacy, we will be exposing not only the respondent party, but we will be actually exposing the victim and the victim survivor. So I think special attention to this datable phenomenon has to be taken, because things tend to get extremely muddy, for the lack of a better technical term. And that's why very, very careful attention must be paid to what it is that we're saying when we are communicating about a case of gender-based violence.
Thank you so much, Anna, particularly for this last highlights. I'm aware of this article that you referred, and we can also include it in the email that will follow up, because it's a concept that we see as a pattern indeed repeated in cases of gender-based violence. Thank you so much for answering this last question. Please stay with us for the last Q&A session, and I will now move on to our second guest today, Maxime. Maxime is both an academic and a senior expert in policy analysis and gender equality, with a 15-year long experience of applied research in the field of social sciences and public policy design. As an academic, he's a senior researcher and lecturer at Sciences Po Paris, and as a consultant, he has been involved in designing, implementing, and independently evaluating gender equality action plans and gender training instruments for private and public organizations. Maxime, thank you a lot. Thanks a lot for being with us. And similarly, we follow the same approach. We have some questions for you. First one is actually highlighting some common pitfalls or mistakes we see. So based on your experience, what are the common mistakes that institutions tend to make in their initial response to gender-based violence cases, and how can this be avoided?
Thank you for your question, Pan. Maybe I should first indicate that I will be certainly more extensive in my answer to that first question, because I think that as for the two other you asked me, they have been already partly answered by Anna, and also in your prior presentation. And also, I think I should specify from which position I'm talking now. I'm talking as someone who has been involved in designing a gender equality plan and an anti-sexual harassment and gender-based violence policy in my own university, as part of a EU-funded project. That was the project IGERA under FP7, and then we continued through two different projects as evaluators, which also provided us with a capacity to support our own institution in auditing, correcting, improving its policies. But apparently it wasn't enough. And we have been facing different crises of quite a significant magnitude due to the positioning of our university, Sciences Po, as a leading social science university in France, and also as one which is particularly under media scrutiny due to typically and historically training our future ministers or chief of state. So that create like a particular resonance for any situation happening in our university. So my experience is based on witnessing, to some extent participating also in the policy response in such like successive crises. And I would like to very much bring flesh to our discussion, provided that Anna was extremely comprehensive in the guidance that she provided, which is consistent with this checklist designed by UniSAFE and UniSAFE on this matter. So I think that the first thing we should consider is that whatever the checklist or tools we have, although a checklist like the one that you've been designing is extremely useful to get us prepared, and also in case a situation arises, to avoid certain mistakes, and if those mistakes have already been made, to correct as much as possible the situation. But although it is very instrumental to getting prepared to some extent, and for some reason, you are never prepared enough. So to what's going to happen. And there are several common reasons or patterns to not getting fully prepared. The most obvious is something that Anna already did mention, is that at the moment when such a crisis arises, such a case arises, provoking a crisis due to unpreparedness or to insufficient institutional response, some of the institutions concerned do not have yet a reporting mechanism or a policy to deal with gender-based violence and sexual harassment. So in this case, the default setting is that they are automatically caught off guard because they don't have anything to respond, or the mechanisms that are already in place are notoriously insufficient and ineffective, which makes little difference with having nothing, to be fair, and which adds on the top to the starting point situation of the communication crisis some degree of self-complacency. Oh, but we had something in place, though. So this makes the situation even somehow worse than having nothing, because at least you acknowledge that you had nothing and you were caught off guard. If you had something, but that you knew, or it was widely known that it was largely insufficient and that it had no record of effectiveness, then you pretend you had something, although you had pretty much nothing to respond to the situation. So that's something that still happens. And of course, a clear first mistake in this case is not to have a robust reporting mechanism in place and basically hiding behind your finger, hoping for the best being that no case will be brought to public awareness, or that no case will happen at all. And if this is your departing situation, any initial institutional response that you will bring will be durably shadowed by the absence of any robust mechanism in the first place. So whatever you will do after, even if you quickly move to using the gender safe guidelines or checklist, will be shadowed by this departing starting point situation, which is truly problematic. But let's focus on those situations which, like mine, have or had a mechanism in place. They are usually also caught off guard, although to a lesser extent. And why are they caught off guard if they do have a mechanism in place? It's usually because the reported gender-based violence situation does not fit their script. So they had a script. The script can be even supported by the checklist that you presented in detail, which is very comprehensive, and still not fitting the script. Mm-hmm. So what do I mean by a non-script situation? And my experience is that usually what happens and what is brought to public awareness and to the awareness of the community are in-script situation more than script one. So you have a standard situation that you would like, that you are more or less ready to address, and it will never be that one. The reason why it's unscripted, as I say, it's usually due to such cases happening outside the premises or the standard functioning of the institution. So, for instance, at student gatherings, sport events, in informal events among staff members, during a mobility year outside the university in a foreign country, or during a traineeship or a practice that is part of the curriculum, but which is not an internal part, not something that happened within the university, for instance. So in this situation, our institution tend to either implicitly or explicitly deflect or deny responsibility. And they will first focus on highlighting this discrepancy. Oh, but this is not within our scope. This is something that we have no control over, instead of addressing the case. And there will be time lost and credibility lost, which is more crucial even in deflecting that responsibility because of the unscripted character of the case that is brought to public awareness. So that's something which is quite frequent. And what is negated, which is declined there, is that universities have a broad, far-reaching responsibility when it comes to guaranteeing a safe work and study environment to their staff and students, because there is a tight web of regulation for any part of the community to work and to function, like student organization or sport event. There are internal policies in place that might not be directed to gender-based violence, but to respecting ethics, code of conduct, etc. There are training provided on different topics, including personal safety to the staff and possibly to the student. There are some alert mechanisms in place. And because they have the broader responsibility to establish a culture which is not conducive for gender-based violence. So by saying, oh, this is not within our scope, they are usually completely missing the point of what is their social responsibility as universities. So that creates like already a problematic situation from scratch. But there are also non-script gender-based violence, and here I will come with a couple of examples concerning my own institution, which are arguably exceeding the scope of an anti-harassment and sexual violence policy. So not only they are not taking place within usual or standard premises, context, functioning of the organization, but they are clearly happening outside any academia-related context. So the two real examples I have had like dire outcomes for some of the people involved and for the institution credibility as a whole, and for even its relation to state power and even its funding. So in 2021, for instance, the head of the foundation, which is overseeing our university, which is a public one, but placed under a private law foundation, was accused in a widely publicized book of perpetrating sexual aggression over a teenage son of his partner. And although the situation had been brought to the knowledge of the director, no internal investigation was triggered, considering that this then respected professor was in contact with a student within the institution too. So there were like this negation of the connection to our responsibility. What was the result? A public outcry, immediate coverage, very negative for the institution. Ultimately, the director resigning within a month, knowing that that director had supported our first gender equality policy and gender-based violence mechanism, and that he was one of the 10 UN-selected he or she university champion for gender equality. So you can imagine like the overall situation and damage. So that was the first situation. So the consequence, which was positive, but which was really under the pressure of the event, was that a full recast and external audit of our gender-based violence and sexual harassment policy was carried out following the situation. I was consulted, many other experts, few other experts were consulted from outside the organization, which were like uncompromising with our poor response, and also from within, like those involved in EU-funded project. We brought a lot of material that was taken into account, and a full recast was carried out. That was in 2022. At the end of 2023, the next director was briefly detained along with his wife for mutual allegation of domestic violence. What was the reaction then? It was to argue with the advice of a cabinet of communication crisis, and also from his own background, the director as a crisis management specialist who wrote a book about it, to argue that this was a painful private matter and that it was not concerning the organization. Student protest, public outcry, negative media coverage, and within 3 months this time, he resigned. So we are now in the final process of selecting a third director within a few years, two having been removed by the pressure of the event and the poor institutional response of the organization. And here I summarize what we can learn from that. Institutional reaction to often non-script scenario do point to several mistakes. Unpreparedness, that's the first one. Lack of demonstrated effectiveness of existing mechanism in some cases, but also the naive division which is maintained between private and public realms. I say naive because this division is a political topic for long, and it is widely known that when it comes to fighting gender-based violence, while it is absolutely necessary to preserve the privacy of the alleged victim and to give legal guarantees also to the alleged perpetrators, the notion of privacy as a whole cannot go undiscussed.
Yes.
Then there is also the division between university versus non-university settings, because non-university settings might fall within the social responsibility of the university as a work and study place. Entrusting crisis management to external expert on crisis management. Here I might say something quite different from what Anna said. I believe that expertise in crisis management is relevant, but not in whatever type of crisis management, because many of the experts in that field, their primary concern is to preserve their reputation and to avoid legal liability for their client. We are not talking about clients here, and we are not talking about protection, as we are talking about transparency, accountability, professionalism, as it has been said largely by Anna and in the prior presentation. So we are not talking about people who just come to extinguish a fire, not to engage with the case itself or with the community. Another mistake that is revealed is that vertical and authoritarian, yet not authoritative crisis communication makes a lot of damage, and that adopting new policies under event pressure is a response, is necessarily part of the response. But if you don't update the governance, the decision-making, or the communication structure, nor you alter the institutional culture as a whole, it will be just like reacting under pressure.
Right. Thanks, Maxime. You highlighted some important areas that indeed might be outside of the standardized framework that we have in mind when we talk about gender-based violence cases. And okay, Anna touched upon it as well. You also mentioned that we discussed it in depth, but what is the role of empathy in crisis communication? How can actually institutions ensure that their message are both empathetic but also authoritative?
Yeah. Well, I will be much shorter because I think that it was widely covered by Anna and in greater detail. I think that here we are first to ask the question: to be empathetic with whom? So I think that reported, I don't like, because in French, alleged victim is, it's related to allegation, which means largely unsubstantiated claims as per default setting. So reported victims, let's say, should be the first that we have to empathize with. We can, of course, exert reasonable caution where circumstances in particular are largely unclear yet, but empathizing with a potential victim is a preliminary step, because it means that we care about the situation and that we will be serious in the way we will handle it. We should also, and it has been pointed out already, we should also empathize with the community as a whole, with the fellow employees, the fellow students, both, whose safety concerns have been heightened by the situation, whose mutual trust and trust into the institution has also been damaged. Considering that the case is first and foremost a distressing situation for the reported victim or victims, but which also affect the whole community, and not just an unpleasant circumstance which is potentially damaging an individual reputation or the one of the institution, we have first to acknowledge that, so that empathy can support transparency, but also consistency in the response. So as it has been said, by providing protection, by providing services and assistance to the reported victim, by transparently communicating about the different institutional steps and the best effort that are invested to address the situation, while preserving confidentiality if required by the victim and respecting due legal guarantees for both the victim and the reported perpetrator.
Right.
All of that can be supported by empathy, because empathy, it's not self-identification. It's more complex than this. It's not like immediately identifying with the claim of the victim, and it's not. It's neither to be patronizing. It's taking things seriously and caring for people's safety, well-being, and assistance. So I think it's a transparent reaction. An authoritative reaction will be best supported precisely with empathy, with that type of empathy.
Right. Thank you, Maxime. Thanks a lot. And last question before we go to the Q&A session. How should institutions approach the internal communication of gender-based violence to ensure that we keep transparency, we maintain trust within the community? And now we're focused more on the internal aspect of this communication.
Well, I think that the checklist that has been designed is quite comprehensive about that. Like it shows the different steps that should be taken. It shows also the necessary consistency and articulation between communicating with external stakeholders and with the community from within. I think that, again, empathy, but also the consistency in the response of the institution are two decisive components. Both are crucially missing in the two examples I gave of unscripted situation leading to considerable damage. Empathy was lacking for clearly, but also the consistency of the message. Consistency with what the institution has been doing before on the topic, and consistency from one step to another of the process. So I think it's important to have both preparedness to act, especially on non-script situation, and to fully acknowledge the role of academic institution as exemplary work and study places are also two ex-ante prior condition for both internal and external efficient communication. But with regard to internal communication, I will just highlight this. I think that institution will be necessarily better equipped if on a daily basis they have effective participatory communication channel with all components of their community. So that includes students, that includes all staff categories, external stakeholders, external but stakeholders, but which are directly related, like alumni, for instance. and that they have built a fairly good record regarding their social and community dialogue, you know, because this builds trust in the long term. Because as in the cases I mentioned, if you have successive crises, each time your credential, also about internal dialogue, are going down. So it makes more complicated to hold the community together when such a situation arises. So accountability, regular reporting, and the support provided to the community along the lines that have been described by Anna and by you earlier are key.
Excellent. Thank you both. That was very, very insightful. Thanks for this insightful and areas that we're usually missing out from the big picture when we talk about the crisis management response. Now I would like to invite our participants for their questions.